Is this the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess? Well, this time it's a trick question, and the answer, I suppose, technically is no, because that's a knight's pawn, not a rook's pawn, in all the other positions that we've looked at in all the previous videos. But we have seen some knight's pawns in some of the previous videos anyway, when I was looking at the pawn on the 7th rank. So, yeah, I mean, silly trick question, but the point is, does anything change when it's a knight's pawn rather than a rook's pawn? And from the attacker's point of view, the main point is that we're going to save one tempo coming over here, and then one tempo coming back. Not that path, but that's the general idea. That because of that, these positions are usually won for the attacking side. Like all the stuff we've seen so far with a rook's pawn, because that's been sort of, you know, the biting point of win-draw the entire time. If you give the attacker, do the attacker a favour by bringing the pawn into the knight's file, then yeah, it's much easier to win. So I guess the defending side would need to have sort of certain advantages to begin with. Like here, for example, the white king is cut off from coming to f3 rather than starting with the white king on e3, like in what we think is the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess. That's the one we're voting for, remember, when we do that chess question in the pub quiz. So this extra tempo, I mean, this is the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess. Remember, that's what we're going for. Let's just quickly go through the main winning attack for white as a reminder with the interference idea. So this is where white plays king d4, and you should know by now, if you watched the previous videos, that black now plays g5, of course. But remember that if black plays this natural move, rook takes f2, they've now objectively lost. And the main trick is we shift the rook, the black rook comes back, we push the a-pawn. And then the key move here is king c4. It's the only winning move, but it's a very good winning move. And interference is what we're going to be going for. So that interference line is demonstrated in this king g4, king b3 hits the rook, rook to a6, check, king takes the g-pawn. Rook to a4, and the black rook is lost for the a-pawn. And the entire dynamic that's going on in this setup, and this is true for the knight's pawn as well, is we're going to win the black rook for our a-pawn, or our b-pawn in that position that I was in the middle of looking at. And then it's, can the white king get back in time? And in terms of counting tempi, it's not all about counting this way and then this way. There is a bit of this way and this way going on when we think about king geometry. And I mean, for example, f1 is a pretty key square for the white king to get to here, as the white rook struggles to deal with, or doesn't struggle rather, to deal with these three pawns. If the white king can get on the scene, and it can, in 1, 2, 3, 4 moves it can get to f1, then the white rook deals with things very nicely, checking from the side. Okay, so that was 4 moves for the white king to get to f1, whereas in the variation where we hadn't bothered with interference and we'd just gone off and defended the a-pawn to free up the rook, and eventually we might have our king on a7, for example. If king takes a7, it happened in a different variation. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that's 2 tempi saved by doing the interference idea rather than the primitive go and defend the a-pawn. So all of that needs thinking about, and I'll just take this a bit further. So king takes h4. It's worth remembering this position. Okay, so the black pawns are on their wave starting square, if you like. Our king is on b3 and it's white to move, and this position ended up as a win for white, just. Okay, it's close. So if you gave black 1 extra tempo anywhere, I mean, there's the win. Let's just go back to that move 8 it was from the starting position. There you go, white to move in that position is a win for white, but it is close. Okay, and that's worth remembering. Black king on h4, white king on b3, it's white to move, and that's a win for white, just. I don't think it matters too much where the white rook is I'm sure you could contrive a circumstance where, yeah, it does, if it was on h8, whatever. But you get the point. It's the king position that's important. We need to get the white king back. Ooh, not there. Need to turn the white king into a magician. Yeah, white king back to I guess, onto the scene. F1 is not always the square the white king wants to go to, but it probably is if the black king is on g3, for example, and our king's on e2, then that's obviously going to be a good move. So let's go back to this this starting position where I asked at the beginning of this video the trick question. Is this the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess? And it's like, no, it's a trick question because this is knight's pawn, but it's like, come on, this is obviously the same stuff that we're still studying. But this tempo gaining, going that way and then coming back that way is a thing. But I mean, something I thought about is like, well, it's not just that way and that way, is it? It's that way and that way that we need to think about as well. Because in that previous position, we saved 2 tempi, even though it was A file, B file, but because it was 7th rank, 3rd rank. Anyway, let's get on with this game, which this is a game from 1972. And there is also, in the midst of it all, you know, you think rook's pawn to knight's pawn. Oh, right, well, the attacking side's got a massive advantage on what we had before there. There's actually something interesting where the defending side gets an advantage from it being a knight's pawn. So we'll get onto that in a sec as well. So in this game, I mean, the white king has to do something here. Well, you know, to make progress, the white king comes over. So king f1. Black just sort of sensibly shuts out the white king and then gets the king active. So that all sensible moves so far by black. White pushes the f-pawn, because I guess they want to lose it on f3 rather than f2. Rook back to b3, and then white makes a run for it with king d2. Now in the game, rook takes f3 was played, and it's incredible the number of times that snatching this f-pawn is the losing move. And for me, it's sort of a bit of an enigma, because most often it seems to be like, oh, that was the critical mistake. But sometimes it's the only move to stay in the game. It's so hard to work out when you snatch the f-pawn and when you don't. But that's what was played in the game. And we'll get back to that in a sec, how white ended up winning that game. Although I think it sort of many twists and turns to come in the game, just showing you how difficult this stuff is, particularly rather than these grandmasters, the blunders they're making. They're not really. It's hard. But here's the defending side's extra trump from this being a knight's pawn rather than a rook's pawn. So what black should have played here was king e6. What's so good about this? King c2. And then, yeah, the black rook is hit. Don't take the f-pawn again. That throws away the game. There's a game played in 1991 where that is what black did, and white won. I won't get sidetracked by that, but stay hitting the b-pawn. Keep the white rook pinned to defending its own pawn from in front. It's not good for white. King c3, and then this is the bit. King d5. That doesn't work if it's on the rook's pawn, because the white king will now just sort of come to b4. But even in the circumstance where, for some reason, black's managed to get the opposition and shut out the white king. So even if we looked at that, I just sort of created a little aside. Imagine this position. You think, what's so good about this? Why couldn't we have done this against the rook's pawn if it's so marvellous? This position here is like, yeah, okay, the white king can't come into b4 and hit the rook. But there's still sort of just too much space, and the black king's gone off. The black king's sort of just gone out of bounds, basically. Rook c7 check. A couple of choices here for black. If king b5, refusing to come back and hit the rook, then we can just push the a pawn. Okay, and that's gonna. Well, you can see that's pretty good for white. The black king is just completely offside. We're going to be taking on f7, and to be honest, we're probably going to be bringing our king this way to do some damage with that white pawn on a7 just pretty much untouchable. So you'd think, well, black surely then has to come and hit the rook. But then we can snatch on f7. Rook takes a6, leads to a rook swap, which is sort of a trivial king and pawn ending win. So black might think to take with the king, but just look how far away that king is. Rook f6 check, king b7, rook takes g6. All right, black can get the f-pawn back. But the white king's just on the e file, the black king's on the c file. We might see rook f8, rook g5. It's gone. So yeah, that was sort of the first question I asked. I mean, Dvoretsky doesn't cover this in the book, but when it was like, aha, look at this defensive idea that black now has because it's a knight's pawn. I'm just, well, if that's so marvelous, why doesn't it work for the rook's pawn? Just come and challenge the white king getting in. And well, we've just seen why that doesn't work. So yeah, carrying on then with this 1972 game, as my computer starts to go slow again. Yeah, just to finish off on that, if white might try, I don't know, g4, activating the king side pawns, whilst the black king's sort of a bit in no man's land. Black can just bring the rook back down, and it's the king can come in this way, whilst the black rook deals with the h pawn, and we can always use our f pawn to deflect, to do something. What's the word? Necessarily defensive, if we wanted to at some point. So that was the way for black to draw it. And as is often the case, snatching this f pawn leads to a loss. So white plays rook c7. You might now be wondering, why didn't you just snatch all the pawns? Just keep going. Just keep snatching pawns. Just say, yeah, all right, I'm losing my rook for the b pawn. Don't care. I'm going to have a king and 3 pawns against your rook. What are you doing about that? Well, this is what white's doing about that. King c2, guarding the b3 square. You can't have a queen against those pawns, so you've got to do something here. Rook g2 check, king b3, rook down to b1, threatening rook b1 to pick up the b pawn, or just get back on the b file. King b2, rook g4, rook g2 is obviously, check's obviously blocked by rook c2, so rook g4. If king back to b3, we're going to go around in circles, but white can play this rook c3 move, and now, we are going to be losing our rook for that pawn. But in fact, black can actually snatch the h pawn as well. So I've got all 3 of your kingside pawns now. Now what are you doing? Okay, b7, rook b4 check, rook b3. There's the rook gone. And this is why I was saying, remember that position from a minute ago. Hopefully I've still got it there. Yeah, so it's white to move with our king on b3. And the black king is on h4. So the black king's already quite nicely advanced. And remember, that was a win just. Here, the white king is on b2, which is just as good as b3, if you imagine we're trying to get to the f1 square. It is black to move, but the black king is on f6. So 2 moves just to get down to... I mean, the black king clearly needs to get down the board to support its support its pawns. So that's a win. I mean, investigate it for yourselves if you want, or just... For me, in comparison with that, it's if that's a win, then that's obviously a win. But investigate it as well. Try and win it against Stockfish. Why not? As all good practice. So yeah, so black snatched the f pawn, which was already the losing move. We've seen what happens if they snatch the g pawn as well. So in the game, rook back to b3, the b pawn's pushed, and now the rook's just sort of tied down to defending that b8 equals queen promotion. And the white rook's sort of free out on the side. King f5, king c2, this is what was played in the game. Black played rook b6. We saw rook takes f7 check. If instead, by the way, black had played rook b5, the king can come up the board, king g4, and then it's the interference idea. Rook c4 check, king takes g3. Rook b4, and again, by comparison with that other position, that's going to be, if we just finish that off, I suppose, that's white to move with their kings on c3 rather than b3, so that's obviously a lot better. So rook b6, and it's really quite clever, the way that white sort of wins this, with the rook being free. So rook takes f7 check, king to g4, and you'd think interference again is the way forward. So something like rook d7, and sure enough, if king takes g3, there it is. That's a win. But actually, black's got this really clever not taking the pawn straight away. And the idea is that when the white king comes up the board, Now the interference thing is just that little bit slower, and black's going to gain the crucial tempo or tempi that he needs. So now you can take on g3. You know, and white, you'd be like, well, that doesn't work. I'm still going to do the interference thing. It's like, yeah, you are, but now it's black to move, and their king's already on g3. So h pawn goes, draw. Again, investigate that one yourselves. We're into rook versus pawn, but that one is a draw. I've got a feeling if the g pawn was missing, it wouldn't be. Not because the g pawn's coming down the board, but it's going to be blocking that very useful check. But yeah, let's not get sidetracked by that. So rook d7, the interference idea doesn't work because of king h3. Now white's still winning this, but only if they go and play the move they should have played instead of rook d7, or in fact other rook moves delaying that idea. Because remember, if black takes on g3, then instead of king h3, then it was a win. So rook c7 wins, rook e7 wins, all from the same idea, that pawn on g3 is still poisoned. It was bringing the king up, lost as an extra move, because the interference idea was check and then check back on d4, and that was the extra move that black needed to take on h4. So not rook d7, but white's got a really very clever move that just sort of puts black in I guess a bit of a zugzwang, really. So, and it's rook g7, and still the g pawn can't be touched. Engine's got king takes g3 as the best move, but we can see very clearly that that's just a win for white. Rook takes g6 check is the idea there. So the black king sort of, well, the black rook, sorry, is ideally placed. So we might see king h3, and because this time the king coming to c3 isn't stopping any interference ideas, because interference isn't the idea. It's the rook takes g6 check deflection idea that's going to be going on. So yeah, the white king can just come up the board, king c3, and after rook b1, for example, just staying on the b pawn, now we can play rook d7, because the deflection idea is it's not just a deflection. Black's going to lose their rook this time. You know, if black takes on g3, there takes back to g3. This time we're getting a queen, and that's an easy win for white. And the engine's got plus 13 in that position. So that means black has to spend another move threatening the g pawn with rook to b6. Okay. But now we can just keep marching the king up. The king's getting pretty close to that rook now. Black's got to do something. Takes. This is what happened in the game. King takes h4. Rook b3. Rook gets lost, and it's that position. This time it's black to move. The f-pawn's already gone, but the white king's already on the c-file. So, yeah, imagine if that original position, if the black pawn was still on f7, it was white to move with the white king on b3. So there's nothing wrong with our first move being king c4. We're still headed towards the f1 square if we want to. Right, next, this is a position from 1974. It is black to play. It's actually Portiche versus Petrosian, this 1974 game. And Petrosian very sensibly just got on with activating the king. Okay, so he wants to get this f6, g5 stuff in. Obviously, moving your king down the board if this b pawn is already advanced is a bad idea, because we're going to get a check and then promotion of the pawn. So, you know, you've got to be careful as you do that sort of stuff with black. But if you just stay passive, it's not going to be good, particularly the fact that this is a knight's pawn rather than a rook's pawn. So white is going to save one tempo going that way, and another tempo coming back. So yeah, I mean, let's just quickly look at that, the staying passive idea, because it also illustrates a nuance of it being a knight's pawn, not a rook's pawn, which I thought was quite good. So, I mean, I just invented king g8 as just a silly move. White just gets on with it, and black comes back to g7. So that was the doing nothing. But it is interesting Because if white just carries on pushing the pawn here, we've actually transposed into a 1986 game involving Tony Miles as white, and Miles did win it pushing this b pawn. We're also about to transpose into lots of other games as well, and see that instructive point on it being a knight's pawn. Black king finally comes in, king f6, king e3, and this is basically the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess again, isn't it? It's the starting position, but with a knight's pawn instead of a rook's pawn. And this position has occurred in 4 different master level games in the database that I'm looking at in years 1986, 2022, 2006 and 2013. All 4 were won by white, and black didn't play the best move in any of them. King e6 was played in 3 of the games, but none of them played king e5. Completely a losing move if everything's one file shifted over this way, but it's the shortening of the space that means it's actually okay for black to come in and do that. We have actually also transposed into a 1984 game here, which did end in a draw. So whatever black's move was, it wasn't king e. It wasn't that, because otherwise it would have been that game from before. But yeah, so I thought that was quite interesting. It sort of illustrates the knight's pawn thing again. You can bring your king a bit more into the middle to face off the white king. So it's worth remembering, I guess, as the defending side as a possible defending idea if you get into these positions. Where was I? Yeah, so b6 was fine for Tony Miles back in 1986, but according to the engine, it's not the winning move. White should actually just get active, king e4. Okay, so I'm not going to get sidetracked with that particular position, but the point is that the longer black stays passive, the more trouble they're going to give themselves in a minute. And in fact, that was objectively winning for white as soon as black had played this this wasting time, just doing nothing idea. White is winning that with king e4. Although, if they push the b pawn again, then you've got the aha, it's a knight's pawn, I can bring my king into the middle idea going on as well. So let's not get too sidetracked by that, other than the knight's pawn thing that I said. But Petrosian wasn't interested in that, he just got active straight away, king h6. So Portish now played king e3, and after the game criticised himself for that, saying that he should have just played b5, which is more energetic, was his description of it, or Dvoretsky's description of it, at least. But it's not actually that much better. I mean, it's still just objectively drawn. f6, b6, g5. What might white think to do here? Well, a couple of things, one of which is quite interesting, is tactics lurking in rook endgames again. One thing they might think to do is get the rook to b8, so they've always got this possibility as a threat sort of lurking on the horizon, which black's got to think about. Takes. Now what should black do here? I like this next move that black should play. I like it when I'm trying to learn endgames and study endgames, and the sort of the principled move is the move we should play, because otherwise it's a minefield. You know, I've already talked about how sometimes we snatch the f-pawn, sometimes we don't, and it doesn't seem to be, you know, sort of any rhyme or reason to when you do and when you don't, or it can feel a bit like that. But yeah, rook b4. I think that's the move I would want to play, and I would play it, and it is the only drawing move. So that's quite good. Yeah, so just cut off the white king. We might see king e3, king back to g7, king d3, and now here we can snatch the h pawn. If white tries to stop us getting back to the b file, we could end up in some sort of pendulum here with the I will get to the b file. No, you won't. I will, but black's going to win that little debate on that one. Just to illustrate what would happen if black didn't play rook b4, if black instead played something like king g6. Again, white can get active straight away with their king e4, and that was the move that rook b4 should have prevented, and it's too late now to try and stop the white king getting in. In fact, the engine's saying we should just be pushing the f pawn now, I guess trying to entice that forward, which would be losing, wouldn't it? Because the pawn could go all the way to b7 then, and we're going to be picking up the f pawn. That'll be similar to plan 3 in the balance on one wing, rook in front of the 7th rank pawn on the other wing video. There's so many prerequisites you have to keep track of. But we don't even have to worry about that f4 idea. We can just bring the king over, and we're going to end up in a much better position. We're going to like 2 or 3 tempi up on what we're the sorts of positions we're about to see in the game. But yeah, rook in this position here, rook b8, nice idea, but black can draw with rook b4. Okay, so what else might white think to do instead of rook b8? Well, this line I really like. Get active with the king straight away. And this was the minefield I was talking about. Like, more often than not, snatching that pawn is the critical mistake. But here it's the only drawing move. You're like, right, how am I meant to know about this? It's like, I don't know. I really don't know how I'm going to be working out when I should be taking on f2 and when I shouldn't. All I know is that if I ever get this position as the defending side, I'm going to be sat at the chessboard knowing that, you know, that is a hard decision to make at any given time. Let's see white's the draw here. White shifts the rook. We come back behind the b pawn, b7. I mean, pause the video here if you want and see if you can find black's next move. Black's got a couple of drawing moves, but one of them is very entertaining. Tactics, always lurking in rook endgames. And that was long enough to pause the video. f5, check, bosh. Like, you know, that's one of those moves. If I was at the board, I'd look at that and I'd think, well, that's just a stupid move, isn't it? Just have your f pawn, you've given up, and then it'd be like, oh. You know those moves where you're at the board and your opponent plays them and they look stupid, and there's that moment of, oh, okay, hadn't seen that. All chess players surely can relate to that. And then you've seen it like, what do you do? I mean, you just got to take it, really, haven't you? And there was a moment there where the engine thought that rook d6 check was still winning, but not. But here's the idea. Obviously, your b pawn's gone, and that's clearly drawn. So yeah, I thought that was interesting to show. Anyway, the point is that criticism by Portish of himself afterwards that b5 was meant to be much better, more energetic. It wasn't that much better. It wasn't any better, to be honest, than king e3. In fact, king e3 is the engine's top move. Petrosian got on with the plan. f6, rook b6. There was a bit of messing about. And then he's like, okay, well, I can't stop you doing this g5 idea. Again, what about b5 in this position? Just get on with pushing the b pawn. It doesn't achieve anything any more than what was played in the game. g5, get active with the king. Black can exchange on h4, and now just play king g6. Okay. You have to be careful. There is, you know, you might think to come and snatch the h pawn. That's a losing idea. This is now lost. White can shift the rook down to h1, rook down to a4. It's like, wish I hadn't snatched the a pawn now, because yeah, white's going to be getting a queen at this rate. And there's the block. There's a check. King b6. It's gone. Okay, so you didn't have time to snatch the h pawn with that rook b4 check, but it is still drawn. King g6. Push the b pawn. What would you play here next as black? Would you take the f pawn, or would you play king f5? Is this one of those times you can take the f pawn, or one of those times that you can't? What do you reckon? Well, it's one of those times that you can't. King f5 was the correct way to go and draw this position. Rook takes f2. Rook shifts. Rook back to b2. King makes contact with the b pawn. We might see some checks back with the b pawn. But yeah, I mean, this is just completely gone now. The white rook can drop back, and black hasn't even got a way to make progress on the king side. So yeah, white's got the king contact with the b pawn now. Where was that then? I think I'd covered everything there, hadn't I? Yeah, just don't snatch the f pawn. Just play king f5 and would reach sort of similar to the drawn positions from the game. Anyway, rook b8 was played in the game instead of b5. Petrosian just got on with it still. g5, b pawn finally pushed. We saw some exchanging on h4, king to g6. All of this stuff is still just drawn, both sides playing good moves. b6, king into f5, so that king is now committed to being sheltered behind its f-pawn. Can't step out because of the, well, once the white pawn's gone to b7, that is. Which it could do here, by the way, b7. But yeah, just cut off the white king. It might come towards your rook. In fact, it probably should. It's the only way to make progress. You can't move your rook off the b file now, but your king is sheltered behind the f pawn. And you know, by the time white's got forward with their king, we're snatching the f pawn, and then we can come back. And yeah, I mean, there's no way for white to make progress there. If ever they make a run for the b pawn, we're going to get a drawn version of rook versus pawn. The king's going to be able to step out. You know, once the white king's on c6, for example, then we can step out, take a check, but take the h pawn, and then just lose our rook for the b pawn. We're easily going to have a drawn version of rook versus pawn. Although if our king's stuck on the h file there, we might have to push the f pawn first. But yeah. So where had I got to there? So that was if pushing the b pawn straight away. In the game, king d4 was played. What would you do here as black? Another chance to pause the video and decide. Now do we snatch the f pawn? Or do we do something else? The answer is we do something else. Okay. So rook takes f2 was played in the game. It's a losing move. It doesn't mean that doesn't necessarily mean the game was lost. It was, but it's not over yet. There's still some twists and turns to come. But rook takes f2 was played, and yeah, it's a losing move. Black should instead go after the h pawn. Okay, you've got one more move for your king to be out in the open. Just one more move. Rook g8 check, king takes h4, king c5. So we're going to see something similar here to the thing I was just talking about a minute ago, where our rook's going to get lost for this, but our king is, you know, stuck to the edge of the board. So, you know, what would you do here? Check. We keep checking the king, coming back and hitting the b pawn. Another check. And now we can snatch the f pawn. b7, rook b2. So this is now incredibly similar to what I was talking about a minute ago. King c7, it's like, uh-oh. And I think I said something like, we'd have to use the f pawn here, wouldn't we? And that's exactly what we do. f5. Although king h3, I'm looking at the engine moves, is also a draw, apparently. But I would think to push the f pawn, personally, rather than this sort of shuffling where we might end up getting checkmated or forced to knight after a king g1. And I'd be worried about that. I'd probably just push the f pawn. I want my king off the side of the board, and yeah, that is also a draw. So king g4 not played in the game. Rook takes f2. I mean, as I said, I said earlier, when do we take the f pawn? When do we not? It does seem difficult to choose, but it does seem like most of the time not. Yeah, if you give white the chance to get their rook out from in front. Rook a8, rook b2, king c5. This is how the game went. Black checked on c2. What would you play here as white? Not played in the game. The engine's on plus 4.6. That doesn't change after the next move, but only because white should then have repeated. So king b5 is what should be played. King d4 is what was actually played. The rook came back to b2. And now white has only one winning move. And it's basically to admit that their last move was rubbish. Bring the king back to c5 and then come to b5. Just get the king up the board, supporting that b pawn. That was the trick. And then I think we've already seen a position similar to this, haven't we? Where we can make progress with our king and pawn. We're at least going to get the king on b8 and the pawn on b7 before we finally... Well, in fact, our rook's sheltering the king on the a file, isn't it? What am I talking about? Yeah, so we're easily going to... It's one. We can see that that's one. So yeah, in the game, white didn't come back to c5, admitting their last move was silly. Portiche played rook a5 check. It's now a draw again. King e6 was played, which isn't the best move. Apparently king g4 is what should have been played, but this is still okay. King g6. White came in with king c5, and I think this was the last mistake. It's black to play. It is last chance saloon, and this is hard. This is really hard. I'll give you some choices: rook c2 check or king d7. One of those two moves was played in the game and leads to a loss, and the other one is a draw. So in the game, rook c2 check was played, but black should play king d7. And we can look at some of the variations here. So rook a7 check is one idea. Rook a8, just cutting the black king off the 8th rank, is the other idea. If rook a7 check, king back to c8, rook h7, and black can just keep checking, and they're going to be winning the, swapping the b pawn for the h pawn. That's going to lead to a draw. So white might think instead to play rook a8, f5, rook h8, and yeah, but just push the f pawn. f4 takes, rook f5, f2, rook to f8, and then check, king b5, check, king to a6, king into c6, rook f6, king c5, and there's no way for white to make progress there. So that's what should have happened. King d7. Instead, we saw some checking, but really black's just checking the white king where it wants to be, because now the rook's back on a5, some shelter has been created for the white king. Rook a1, rook to c4, b pawn pushed, rook c1 check, king d7, rook to c8, and black resigned in that position. That's everything I was going to cover on that idea. Is this the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess? And no, because that's a knight's pawn. That was the trick question. But yes, really, everything we've seen here is just sort of a continuation of that same position, but with some added instructive points. White's going to save 2 tempi, one going towards the b pawn instead of an a pawn, and one coming back from a b pawn instead of an a pawn. But don't forget that black gets an advantage as well in this line, where the black king can sort of come out into the centre because it's a knight's pawn, which would be a losing idea if it was a rook's pawn. So there was that idea there. It was mainly there, wasn't it, coming into d5. And an extra line that I investigated that's not in the Dvoretsky book, I found it by accident, really, the idea. So I said, what if black does nothing? And it's only here if white now pushes the b pawn, then we come out into the middle, would be a drawing move. Okay, so that position there 4 times in the Masters database, all wins for white, but king e5 apparently is objectively drawn. I think I'll call it a day there. Hope all of that's useful.